new video, and that can help you when, talking to others or maybe encourage you some.
We really appreciate that. You got some great videos. I've seen a lot of them. So you're doing great stuff, and you never stop moving ahead, moving forward. So much good stuff coming out. Well, let's go ahead and
Eric,
talk a little
I
bit
would,
about some of your work, and then go to some. I'm going to ask you some questions myself, and then I'm going to jump to some of the students and people that have joined in. So we want to focus a little bit tonight on the resurrection, of course, and then some of your debates with Bart Ehrman. If some of you aren't familiar with Mike or Dr. Licona, he's debated Bart Ehrman a ton of times. You can watch him online. You can go on YouTube. He's done. Mike, how many times have you debated him now? 3 or 4?
6.
6.
But it depends how you're counting things.
Right.
We've actually had, you could say, 3 public debates, like on campuses. And then we've had a written debate, and that was probably our most substantive one, because, when you're involved in a public debate, you really have to think on your feet. And then later on you think, if I had to do it again, I'd answer it just a little bit differently,
Right.
Well, in a written debate, you have a little more time to think about your answers.
And that debate's online. People can read the written debate online, right?
Yeah, it's at the best school. It's a website called thebestschools.org.
Right.
And you can go there and put in Ehrman Licona debate, and that will come up. Unfortunately, I wish they had it in a single document, but what they do is they interview Ehrman. They have a section for that. Again, this is all written. Then they have a section where they interview me for just opening stuff. And then they have Ehrman's opening statement. Then you go to my opening statement, first response from each of us, and then second response from each of us, and then closing. And we had like 2 weeks to answer, each one. So it was one of these debates that progressed over a course of probably a month and a half. It was pretty cool. So we had that written debate. We've had 3 debates on campuses, and then we've had 2 debates on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable podcast.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, we really appreciate you being here. I just want to start off by saying, I just want to ask you a question before we start specifically talking about the resurrection with your debates. What was it with your background that, we talk about apologetics, a lot of us here, a lot of us have been involved with Ratio Christi. We're familiar with the apologetic methodology. We talked about different methods, classical method, historical method, but why is it for you that you've, I've had William Lane Craig to the campus. I've had Frank Turk, classical apologist. And of course I've had you there, but why is it with you that you've really just decided to hone in strictly mostly on history, like the historical method? Nothing wrong with that. I'm just wondering for you personally.
Yeah. Well, for me, I never really got into the wars over apologetics methodology. It just, that just seems like pettifogging to me.
Okay.
But I mean, if one wants to be a presuppositionalist, fantastic, go for it. If you want to be a classical apologist, fantastic, go for it. I mean, if Paul can say in Philippians 1, about those who were preaching Christ out of envy and selfish ambition and strife, he says, what then? Only that in every way Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. And if he can do that with them, I'm going to rejoice when a presuppositionalist, a classical apologist, or evidentialist, or whatever you have,
Right.
I'm going to rejoice in that. What got me interested in resurrection, when it came to apologetics, I wasn't initially interested in resurrection or historical matters. The scientific stuff interested me more, intelligent design and all of that, especially the stuff from astronomy. But when I began to have doubts in talking to Gary Habermas, he was showing me how the resurrection of Jesus is the one thing that points to Christianity being true. So if you go with, let's say, the scientific evidence for designer of the universe and of life, really cool stuff. That doesn't prove Christianity. It proves God's existence, or the existence of some sort of, generic intelligent designer. That's it. The resurrection of Jesus shows that designer, reveals the identity of that designer. So that's what I really liked about that. Now, the classical apologetics, I mean, I understand, if you start off with God's existence and you move to different things and finally to resurrection, you can give a more comprehensive case. But for all practical purposes, what skeptic is going to give you the time? What non-believer is going to give you the time to go through all of that?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's going to sit there for several hours and listen to you go through all the evidence. Now, maybe, if a person's really seeking, they'll say, all right, I'll meet with you for lunch every week, once a week, and we can do this. And maybe they'll sit down with you for 2 months and you can go through all that. Fantastic if that happens. But on most occasions, that's not what you're going to have. And what got me interested in resurrection, I saw from the scientific evidence that God existed. But the resurrection of Jesus, back when I really started studying this in the mid 90s, I guess you could say, so about 25 years ago, when I really started to study this, not too many people were doing it. Most of them were focusing on arguments for God's existence, the moral argument for God's existence, the cosmological arguments, and teleological arguments. That's what people were focusing on. Christian apologists were focusing on that. Hardly anyone was doing resurrection. You had Gary Habermas, you had Bill Craig.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, there's a need for it here. So when Gary and I finished our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, or I should say, not when we finished it, but while we were writing it, I remember asking him, Gary, here you have 2,200 or 2,400 academic sources from 1975 up to that point. Now he's got, I think, 4,300, he told me a week or two ago. So at that point, he had 22 or 2,400 academic sources on the resurrection since 1975.
Right.
And in a bibliography. And I said, all right, so you have all these scholars, they're looking at the same data and they're arriving at different conclusions. Who are these scholars that you're looking at? Because Gary's the number one guy in the world on this stuff. And he said, well, almost all of them are New Testament scholars. And then you have a few philosophers. I said, well, are there any professional historians? And he said, maybe a handful of them, but none of them have written anything extensive. The most anyone has written, I think, was Paul Meyer at that point. And he had a very small book, that was
I have it. I can't remember the name. I think I have it.
Yeah.
Easter something. I don't know.
Yeah, something like that. And it's just small, and only half of it's on the resurrection. So I thought,
Right.
well, if the question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? That's a historical question. And how many of these New Testament scholars and philosophers had any training in historical method or the philosophy of history?
Mm-hmm.
And if hardly any historians had written on the resurrection, I thought, well, this is something that deserves greater attention. Let's study the philosophy of history, historical method. Let's see how historians go about their task. And then let's do a historical investigation on the resurrection of Jesus using the tools historians use. What would that look like? What kind of results would it yield? And so that's what got me into my doctoral work. And it was fascinating. And then I just got hooked thinking about the philosophy of history and historical method. What is historical knowledge? How do we attain it? To what extent? What about burden of proof and all this kind of stuff? And it's stuff I would have never been interested in before. But as I got into it, it's like, wow, this is just really fascinating. And whereas in grad school, writing a 20-page double-spaced paper with a few footnotes was a nightmare to me, my doctoral dissertation ended up being well over 500 pages, single-spaced with more than 2,000 footnotes. And I never imagined doing anything like that, but I just got so wrapped up in it.
I got to tell you quickly a funny story. The next question. So our president of Ratio Christi about 7 years ago, a guy named Michael, he took your resurrection book, your dissertation book. He read it in 2 days. Now, you know how long that book was. How many pages? 700?
700
pages.
some, yeah.
Yeah, so he went through the whole thing. That's how excited he was. So anyway, wow. He's not normal. Anyway. Okay, well, that's great.
Was that Rick?
No, that was Michael Rudy. You met him a couple of times, but he's graduated now. But
okay.
I don't remember Rick. You got me. Anyway, don't worry about
Oh,
it.
no. Oh, I thought you said the president of Ratio
No,
Christi.
no, at our chapter at Ohio State. I meant,
Oh,
yeah, at our
okay.
chapter. Yeah, no, you're thinking Rick Schenker. Yeah, yeah, no. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about Bart Ehrman. So, why is Bart Ehrman so popular with people in general? Maybe tell our audience here a little bit about him and why he's so popular and why maybe he's so hard to debate, or maybe you don't think he's hard to debate, but I think you've had some good debates with him. Give us a little background about him and why he's such a big figure and so popular and hard to debate.
Yeah, yeah. I've enjoyed my debates with Bart. And believe it or not, as much as we disagree, we've become friends over
Right.
these years. I mean, real friends too. So it's pretty cool. But I mean, we disagree so much on this stuff. We disagree on political issues, on these, on worldview, Christianity stuff. Um, and but I'm at a point, my friendship's at a point where I can challenge him on things, and he doesn't take it personally because he knows I don't mean it personally, and he knows I don't attack him behind his back, and I treat him with respect, and he knows I love him. And
Okay.
so we've developed a friendship. The reason I think he's so popular is because he has a charismatic personality. He speaks with authority. I mean, he is a good New Testament scholar. I think some of his arguments stink, and I've told him that.
Right.
But he is charismatic. He's a great, passionate public speaker, and skeptics love him. So just as a lot of us love and have just grabbed the coattails of William Lane Craig, who I think is probably the greatest Christian apologist who's ever lived. The guy's just a beast. And William Lane Craig, we learned from him just watching him debate, listening to him lecture. Skeptics like to grab on to someone like a Bart Ehrman for New Testament stuff. Of course, for scientific stuff, they really like Richard Dawkins. So, they're good. He and a lot of these other atheist speakers who are really popular, they're just great speakers, and then they're good scholars or scientists. So I think
When I
that's
had
why.
him here, we had him here to debate Michael Brown a long time ago on the problem of suffering. And he told us at lunch that the resurrection or the New Testament wasn't the number one issue for him. It was an problem of evil for him. That's what he told us then. I'm sure you probably know that. Okay, well, let's
Yeah, that led him to away from Christianity. Yeah.
right.
Yep.
Okay, so but we're not going to talk about the problem of evil tonight, but a lot of people are talking about it right now. Okay, so let's talk about something else. So from what I gather, and what he's written and what you've said in your debates, he seems to agree with your historical bedrock that Jesus was a real person. He died. The disciples thought they saw him rise from the dead. They had experiences that they genuinely believed that Jesus appeared to them, and Paul had an experience that he believed was a risen Jesus. But Bart's issue is that the way he comes up with an explanation is the visions hypothesis. Like a lot
Yeah.
of scholars, he says that, well, they had visions. And it seems to me that I'm seeing, and I've done a lot of research too on this, a lot of scholars say that a lot. They say, well, they had visions, they had visionary experiences, but they're not really defining sometimes clearly what they mean by visions. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that, what we mean by visions and whether that's a valid explanation or not, the way Bart describes it?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, you're correct about the historical bedrock. And what we mean by that is these are facts that are so strongly supported by the data that virtually 100% of critical scholars acknowledge them as facts. They agree on these. So whether they are Jewish, agnostic, atheist, Christian, whether liberal, moderate, or conservative, everybody acknowledges these because the data supporting them is so strong. Okay. So yeah, of course, Ehrman is going to grant those. Virtually everybody does, the bedrock. So and so it's like, well, how do you explain it? How do you explain the fact that the evidence strongly suggests that Jesus' disciples had experiences they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus? If he didn't rise from the dead, then what's the nature of these experiences? And so you're right. Ehrman says visions. A lot of skeptical scholars say visions. That is the most popular natural explanation that is given today by skeptics,
Mm-hmm.
visions. So what they mean by that is hallucinations. And Bart brought this up. It was either in our first or second debate. And I said, I think it was our first debate, which was in Kansas City. And I said, well, what he means by this is hallucinations. He's just using visions because in his writings, he says hallucination is a pejorative term. Well, it's not anymore amongst
Mm-hmm.
mental health professionals. So he said, yep, okay, well, that's right. I think they're hallucinations. So now that's Ehrman, but just to be a little broader here, what I would do when I'm if you were talking to a skeptic, what I would do for you, what I would do if I were you and you were talking to a skeptic and they said it was visions, then I would ask them to define what they mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's only two kinds of visions. They're either objective or they're subjective. A subjective vision would be a hallucination. Or they might say it's an altered state of consciousness, an ASC, which is nothing less than a hallucination. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you can call it an ASC, you can call it a vision, but a subjective vision is a hallucination. In contrast, an objective vision would be, let's say, Jesus appeared to them and the appearance did not occur within space-time. So think about the vision that Peter had where he went up on the roof and he fell asleep, right? And he had this dream or vision where sheet came down from heaven and it had creatures on it. And God said, kill and eat these. And he said, no, these are unclean. And God said, what I have called clean, you do not call unclean. So if that actually happened and God was communicating to Peter in that sense, no one else around would have seen it.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow God was communicating in a vision, whether a dream or perhaps Peter was conscious at the time, but only he could see it. That would be an objective vision. In other words, the experience really happened, that Jesus really appeared to Peter at that time, but no one else would have seen it. That's an objective vision. All right. So what I would say, if you're talking to a skeptic and they bring up vision, say, well, what are you talking about? An objective vision or a subjective vision? And,
right.
and just to be clear with them, because they probably haven't thought through this. And once they say, well, it's a subjective, oh, okay, so we're talking hallucinations. In other words, it was just going on in their brain. They really didn't see or hear anything. It was just a misperception of something.
How would that relate to Paul, would you say, when someone brings up Paul's experience on the Damascus Road?
Yeah, well, I like to ask him at that point, okay, yeah, describe why you think that is a hallucination. And what do you think they would say, Eric?
Because, well, they're going to say there was no one else around. It was kind of like a private thing. Paul, there's no way to verify from other witnesses or anything. Paul said he's having this experience. I personally think it's something outside himself he's experiencing. It's not internal, but it's all we have from the passage. And he heard a voice, saw a light. Something was outside himself. But they're going to think it's maybe some sort of hallucination, of course.
Yeah.
Right?
So I would point out a couple of things. I'd say, number one, it's in the book of Acts, and it occurs after the ascension of Jesus. So it is post-ascension. So the nature of the experience is different than what is reported in the Gospels. It's a glorified appearance of Jesus. Now, was it a hallucination? You say, well, it was a private experience that Paul had. It was semi-private because the experience is described 3 times in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 9, in Acts chapter 22 and 26. And in all 3 of them, Paul says he has traveling companions with him, and they saw the light and they heard the voice. They just didn't understand what the voice was saying. So it was semi-private. There were others that were there who participated in this experience. And what we know from the mental health profession is that hallucinations are not group experiences. And the reason we know this is because what a hallucination is, it is a false sensory perception. So it's one of your senses, whether it be sight, hearing, smell, taste, a sense of motion, a sense of touch. One of your senses, it's a false sensory. So you think you see something, but it's not actually there. You think you hear something, but there's nothing producing a noise. It's a false sensory perception.
Mm-hmm.
So you wake up because you had this dream, the sense that you were falling, and you woke up. That is called a kinesthetic hallucination, a sense of motion. Well, if I have a kinesthetic hallucination in the morning that I dream that I'm waking up, my wife doesn't wake up at the same time because she is experiencing the same thing, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can't experience the same kind of dream. So now that's different from an illusion, like an optical illusion, when you and a couple others are in a car going down a highway on a sunny day and you see an optical illusion that it looks like water in the road ahead. So that is a distorted perception, sensory perception. That's all an optical illusion is, but that's different from a hallucination, which is a false sensory perception. You cannot enter my head and experiencing the same hallucination I do because it's in my head. It's a false sensory perception.
Right.
So they're not group experiences. That's one problem with Paul's thing.
Okay. So this visionary hypothesis, and they use that language a lot, but you're saying a lot, as I've noticed too, a lot of time it just has to do with more of a hallucination view. I mean, really, once they go down that road, you can almost guarantee they're really saying hallucination. They just may not use that language.
Right.
And okay, so that leads to my next question. So
And
a
there's
couple
plenty
more.
of
Okay.
other answers for it. I mean, we just talked about Paul there, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. But
let me ask, just say one other thing, Eric, with that. Later on in Acts chapter 13, Paul is preaching,
right.
and he speaks of Jesus's resurrection in bodily terms. He talks about Psalm 16:10, where it says, "You will not allow your Holy One to see decay." And
Mm-hmm.
he said, now that's not referring to David, because David died, was buried, and his body decayed. We know where his grave is. But Jesus died, was buried. His body did not decay, but God raised him up, and we're eyewitnesses of this. So Paul is speaking about whatever the nature of the appearance to Paul. He was convinced it was that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead. Now, if a skeptic comes back, which they will, and they'll say, yeah, but that's Luke reporting on Paul right there. He just probably made that up. And say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, then maybe he made the thing up about Paul's, the Damascus Road experience, the very things that you're using to say Paul had a hallucination, because we don't get that from Paul's letters. Paul's pretty clear it was a bodily resurrection in his letters. So what the skeptic does by discounting what Paul says in Acts 13, it also cancels out any objection he would have or any arguments he has for hallucination by using Acts chapter 9.
Right. Right. It just seems like the bodily resurrection is really important to our apologetic, and it seems like skeptics have to use that visionary hypothesis. They just will use it over and over. I got in debate 2 weeks ago with a skeptic about it online. Okay. So how much of Ehrman's methodology, like his historical methodological approach, is driving his conclusions, with the miracles issue and the way he views history and things like that? Like John Mayer will say he can't really study the resurrection. I don't think he's still written a book on the resurrection, but when it comes to Ehrman, what about him? Like with his historical methodological approach. I don't think he thinks history can touch miracles, right? Or you can
Right.
study
Yeah.
miracles.
He gives pretty much two different arguments against historians using investigating miracle claims. The first one is to say, well, miracle by its very definition is the least probable explanation. Historians have to choose the most probable, and so they can never choose a miracle hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem I have with that, I think that's real easy. I'd say, well, why would you say a miracle is the least probable explanation? least probable in reference to what? Because if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then the resurrection becomes the most probable explanation. It becomes 100%, right? So
Mm-hmm.
least probable in reference to what? Well, being raised by natural causes without God involved. Okay, I'll grant it. If we're going to say a resurrection without God's involvement is the least probable explanation, I'll go with that. But then we wouldn't call that a miracle, would we?
Right. Right. Absolutely.
So that one I think is very easy to answer. The other one is to say, if you say, as soon as you allow a miracle, a historian to look at a miracle, then you bring God into the equation, and a historian has no tools to access God. Okay, so it's like a scientist, a biologist has no tools to access God. You can't
Mm-hmm.
use a test tube or a microscope in order to find God there. You can see data from which you can infer certain things, but you can't reach God through a microscope or a telescope. I can't look through the Hubble Space Telescope and learn about ancient Rome, right?
Mm-hmm.
So historians have different tools than astronomers. An historian doesn't have any tool to say, well, God did this. So he would say that as soon as a miracle requires God, and as soon as you acknowledge a miracle, you acknowledge God. Historian has no tools for that. It becomes a theological explanation, not a historical one. And I think that's mega easy to answer as well. So let's put it this way. Let's take a scientific example. Let's say there's a comet that astronomers have been tracking for a decade, and they've known it is on a collision course with the moon. And they're able to determine that it's going to collide with the moon. It's going to strike the moon on a certain day and at a certain time. And on that day, the comet slams into the moon's surface. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the moon's surface. And it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, an astronomer, everybody would look at that and say, well, that seems to be a miracle. And astronomers would look and say, well, we have absolutely no conception on how this could happen. So they have no tools to identify God as the cause. So an astronomer would say, we don't know how this happened. But an astronomer wouldn't say the event didn't happen. They would have sufficient evidence to know that the comet hit the moon and left the message on the lunar surface. A scientist just couldn't say that God did it. In the same way, a historian could look at an event like the resurrection. Yes, it would be a miracle, but they would look at the resurrection, they'd look at the data, they'd use the tools, the methods of historians, and if the evidence pointed strongly to Jesus rising from the dead, a historian in principle could say, Jesus rose from the dead, we just don't know how it happened.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good. Very good. All right. Just a couple more things, and we'll get to some questions from the students. So what would you say for you over the years, debating the resurrection, what's the toughest objection to the resurrection for you that you've encountered? Or what's maybe on that you've always thought about, maybe like the hardest one to answer personally?
You know, there've just been different times. Like years ago, it was the one that bothered me the most years ago, and I'm talking probably a little over 20 years ago.
Dan Barker debating days. Anyway.
Yeah. No, actually before then.
Okay.
And it was, well, no, it would have been around that time with Dan Barker days. And I was thinking, well, could it be that like I was on a radio program with an atheist talk show host. I lived in Virginia Beach. This guy was in Norfolk, Virginia. I went into the studio and I'm talking to him and he said, well, Mike, how do you know that they just didn't say resurrection, you know, as a way of honoring Jesus, that this was a way to just say that his memory and his teachings live on today.
Right.
And that really just threw me for a loop. And I said, well, you still have to account for the empty tomb, which is true, but that's the only thing I could think of on the spot. Well, later on, I gave it some thought, and it was, okay, now wait a minute. Paul put this argument together in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ has not been raised from the dead, we will not be raised from the dead. And if we're not going to be raised from the dead, this life is all there is, so the Christian life is not worth living. But Christ was raised, therefore we will be raised, therefore the Christian life is worth living. And that argument makes no sense whatsoever, given a view that the resurrection was merely a metaphor to say Jesus was a great man and we still remember him today.
John Shelby Spahn debated William Lane Craig. I watched that debate years ago. He basically said, I don't really care whether Jesus physically rose from the dead. All I know is it gives us great meaning to our lives. So see, that's kind of like that train of thought, the very existential, kind of like an existential meaning is all that matters. So, all right, well, one last thing. So you wrote a book on gospel differences. I know that's the last book you put out. And I know you're writing a more popular version of that right now, like an easier digestible version or something.
Yep. Well, I haven't, yeah, I've got like chapter divisions and notes and stuff. And so I've got a lot done, but I haven't actually started to write it yet. But yeah, that might be my next book.
Okay. So we know that Bart in his debates, that's one of his big issues. He loves to bring up the gospel differences. That's like his bread and butter over and over. Yeah. It sounds like a broken record. What has he accepted your work? Has he read it? And if so, and first of all, what got you so interested in writing that book? And was it a response to Bart or just a lot of things how that all came together? And how's he responded to that work? Or has that made any difference?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Well, what got me interested in it was after I had my second debate with him, I was teaching a graduate level course on the philosophy of history, and we used the resurrection of Jesus as a case study. And the very last day of the course, I had the students watch that second debate with Ehrman. And so at the end, I said, okay, so what'd you guys think? And he said, man, you killed him with the resurrection. But there was this one student in the class, and she said, well, but my faith has really been rocked because Ehrman really criticized the Gospels throughout the debate. They have all these kinds of contradictions. We don't know who wrote them. The authors were biased. They were written too long after the events they purport to describe. And the authors were not eyewitnesses. So and you never answered those. And I said, well, yeah. And the reason I didn't is because they had nothing to do with my argument for the resurrection. If you recall, I used the historical bedrock. And when he criticized those facts or my case, I said, well, wait a minute, Bart, you grant the same facts. So you've got nothing to stand on here. So if you are criticizing the Gospels to this extent, what arguments do you use to arrive at the conclusion that the disciples had experiences they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus? Well, whatever arguments you're using, Bart, consider them to be mine. Now, you've got to show what's the best explanation for this historical bedrock. And she said, yeah, I know. And that made sense. But why didn't you answer about the Gospels? I said, because you only have so much time. In my first rebuttal, I only had 12 minutes. Second rebuttal, I had 8 minutes. And so you have to watch the clock and you have to answer the things that are most relevant. And I said, well, all Ehrman's arguments were red herrings. They really had no relevance to the debate. And she said, well, I'm just really, and her eyes teared up. And she said, it really bothers me. And I asked the rest of the class at that point, I said, how many of you feel the same way? And a number of them raised their hands. And so at that point, see, for me, it was like, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, period. And even if there are all the problems with the Gospels that Bart says there are, which I don't think there are.
Right.
But even if there were all these problems, it wouldn't change the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. Christianity would still be true. If Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity was true at that moment, and it was true all the way up to the time the first gospel was written 20 to 40 years later. So if that's the case, then any problems with the Gospels would not negate the truth of Christianity. So, but a lot of evangelicals have been brought up just like I was, in a very conservative environment. And it's like, well, if anything in the Bible is false, then we can't trust any of it. And that is just terrible, terrible logic. That doesn't make sense at all. So, but when I saw that Christians, a lot of evangelicals were bothered by it, like in the class, I thought, well, I'd like to start looking at these gospel differences then. So the first thing I did was I started, my training's in New Testament. I have a master's and a doctorate in New Testament studies. And in that field, you have to learn Greek because that's what the language the New Testament was written. So I read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 8 times in Greek. And look, when I was doing this, I was in my 40s. And I'd been a Christian since age 10. So I'd read the Gospel so many times. You're so familiar with the stories, your mind just goes on autopilot a lot.
Mm-hmm.
By reading them in the original language, which, I'll never be as fluent in that because it's a dead language. I can never be as fluent in that as I am with English. It really causes you to slow down and look at things. And when I did, I saw all sorts of differences. And I started, making notes of these differences. I had a Word document, and that document grew to more than 50 pages of differences. And, some of them were pretty easy to reconcile right off, but some of them, no, and I'm looking at them and say, I've been saying all these years, there are no contradictions in the Gospels. You can harmonize them all. And I'm thinking, I'm no longer thinking that. And I'm thinking, well, what's going on here? And so I remember having a talk with Craig Keener in Philadelphia years ago. And I said, Craig, I'm looking at some of these differences and I don't know what to do with some of these. What do you think? And he was saying, yeah, that's a tough one. And, this one here, and he's studying ancient biography at that point. And so I decided to study ancient biography because that's the genre in which the Gospels were written. And so with Craig's help, I made a list of all the biographies written within 150 years of Jesus. Now, they were written on other people, of course, but authors, biographers were writing these biographies within 150 years before and after Jesus. And there are about 90 of them. And there are 48 of them were written by a guy named Plutarch, who wrote somewhere between the 90s and the early 120s. So just after the Gospels were written, and he's writing in the same language. And Plutarch is regarded as the greatest ancient biographer. Much of what we know about the ancient world comes from Plutarch. And so I was reading through those, and then as I got through to the end, I realized that a lot of these stories were told more than one time, because a lot of the same characters participated in the same event. So like you've got a biography of Julius Caesar, you have a biography of Cicero, a biography of Brutus, a biography of Antony. And of course, all of these were involved in the story of the assassination of Caesar, right? And so you're going to find the same story told multiple times. So here you've got the same author using pretty much the same sources, and in many cases, writing at around the same time. And he's reporting these stories that occurred 2 to 7 times. And there are 36 stories in 9 of those biographies that appeared two or more times. And so I found, when I focused on those stories, and I found 30 of them contained differences. And then I noticed, wow, the differences are the same kind. There's a pattern here. The same kind of differences end up turning up, which suggested to me these were compositional devices. And then I was reading literature written by classicists, specialists on Plutarch, specialists on the ancient biographies. And I found that they're identifying various compositional devices. They'd been doing this for decades. Things like compression, conflation, displacement, transferal, things like this. And then I'm looking and I'm saying, that's exactly what's going on here. And so I end up doing this really comprehensive study with Plutarch this way, more than anyone else had ever done up to this point. And then I thought, let's go to the Gospels now. Let me look through these more than 50 pages of differences and see if I read these differences in view of these compositional devices that Plutarch and other classical scholars used, would that shed light on these differences? And Eric, it was just amazing. It was like, looking through the right lens now, and the Gospels just cleared up. These differences just cleared up and made so much more sense. And reading the Gospels as ancient biography and in view of these kind of literary devices, it revealed some things in the Gospels I never saw before. The deity of Christ in the Gospel of Mark, it just became crystal clear, whereas it wasn't before. And I just saw things that I never saw before. So I got real excited about it. So I wrote this, I lectured on it. I wrote a book published by Oxford that came out late 2016.
And they made it cheaper, thank God. And
what's that?
They made it affordable, thank God.
Well, they were going to sell it for $135.
Right.
And I told them, I said, please, there's going to be a lot of people who are interested in this stuff. See, Oxford later told me that their average book sells 200 copies in a lifetime.
Oh, great.
Because they mainly sell to libraries, university libraries.
Right.
And I said, I took that big Resurrection book to them. I said, you see this? That sold 5,000 copies the first year. They said a 700-page book sold 5,000 copies the first year. I said, yep. And I showed them some of my other books. And I said, I told them how many copies that had sold. I said, you're going to get a lot more copies if you can make it affordable. So I said, well, let's think about it. And she took it back, and the committee said, all right, let's try it. So they made it for $35 retail, and you can get it, usually get it a little cheaper than that. So, yeah. So that's been neat. Ehrman has read it. He agrees with it. Where we disagree is he says these changes render the Gospels as historically unreliable. And I said, what?
Really?
Yeah. So we argue about that.
That's fascinating. I'm surprised he said that. I'm glad he read it, but that's really surprising since he just tries to hammer that every time.
Well, if you want to see this, Eric, you can go to my YouTube channel and scroll down. It might be on the first page. If not, it's on the second. Look for something in October last year. You'll see a bunch of us sitting on a panel.
I saw that one with Kurt's event. Yes.
Yep.
I watched it.
And so you can see him saying it and he and I arguing there.
Yeah. I remember when you started working on gospel differences years ago, you showed me some early work when you came to High State. You had some notes you showed me. So that's how good my memory is. But that was a long time ago. Okay. Well, I'm done talking. So we're going to go ahead and open it up to you guys now. Let's try to not talk over one another. Maybe just jump in here and ask Mike some of your questions. If you don't have a lot of questions, I'm going to start asking more questions because I can ask him stuff all night, as he knows, because I can talk. So why don't you guys kind of jump in and then try not to talk over each other, one person at a time. Let's show everyone respect. Let them finish the question and go from there. Who wants to go first? Mitchell, go right ahead.
So my question is about Mark 2:25-6, where it says that Jesus says that in the days of Abiathar the high priest, David went in to eat the showbread. But if you look in 1 Samuel, it seems like a different person was high priest at that time. So,
yep.
Yeah, so I've heard people say that this is an obvious mistake. And I was just wondering what you have to say about that. Is that actually a mistake, or is there a way to reconcile that?
I've seen a couple of attempts to reconcile it. And I'll have to admit, it's not, if you look, you do a search. Do you have Bible software of any sort?
No. Okay. I have Bible Gateway.
Okay, well, you can probably find it that way. So do a search for Abiathar and do a search for Ahimelech. Ahimelech was his father. And find every verse in the Old Testament that mentions it, and then look up those verses in their context. And it does get a little bit confusing, actually. So
Hmm.
I don't know exactly what's going on. I don't know how to reconcile it. And I think we have to be open to the possibility that we actually do have an error in Mark. It's possible. Um, we can try to reconcile it, and there may be a way to reconcile it. But we have to be open to a possibility that this may be an error. So I would say in our Gospels, there are just a handful, 5 or less of these kinds of things like Abiathar. Another one would be how Judas died. And, the way Acts describes it compared to how Matthew describes it. And, there are different ways to try to reconcile it, but we have to admit, some of them seem far-fetched. They may be correct, but I think we have to at least be open to the possibility that we have an error here.
Okay,
But
Mike, let's make sure, though, when you debated Dr. Howe, as we know, that definition of error took a lot of time to explain what we mean by that. So maybe some people need to go watch that debate, because that came
Yeah, that
up a
was a
lot in
fun
that
debate.
Yeah, but that came up there a lot. You know what I mean? Defining that.
Yeah. So, when it comes to inerrancy, I consider myself an inerrantist, but not in the strict sense of, say, Richard Howe or Norman Geisler would have. What I would say is even Howe and Geisler today would say that the Bible that we have in our hands has errors. They said it. Geisler said it in his book when critics ask.
The
Or
translations we have, the translations. Yeah.
yeah, our English translation, but not only our translations, but back to the Hebrew and Greek text that we have today. Now they would say that all of those errors were due to scribal corruptions over time. And most of them were. Some of them, don't know. This Abiathar thing, we have no reason to think that was a scribal corruption. There's nothing in the manuscripts that would suggest that. In fact, when Matthew and Luke tell the same story, they don't mention the name Abiathar. So since they use Mark as their primary source, it's almost as though they knew that there was a problem here. And so they just omitted the Abiathar name so that there wouldn't be a problem. So it may go back to the originals, it may not, but here's the point I would make. The Bible that we have in our hands today, according to Norm Geisler and Richard Howe, the Bible we have in our hands today is not inerrant. And they will tell you that inerrancy only applies to the autographs. And we don't have the autographs, and we haven't had them for a very long time. All right. So they are speaking of the inerrancy of text we no longer have, while denying the inerrancy of the text that we have. What I would say is we don't know what the original said, so it really isn't beneficial at all to talk about whether or not they were inerrant. What I would say is that since our present texts are not inerrant, God must not have thought that it was necessary for us to have an inerrant text. So I describe or define inerrancy to say that the Bible is inerrant. The Bible that we currently have is inerrant in all that it teaches and to the extent God intended. And I think that we can say that based on the evidence we have, and it doesn't go beyond what the evidence says. So when we talk about Abiathar, if that is an error, and it may not be, but I think we should be, I think we can have more credibility with non-believers if we just say, hey, it may be, it may not be, but that doesn't change the fact of the resurrection. And it doesn't really change the fact of the story about how David went in and ate the consecrated bread with his men, which, was not allowed at that time. But Jesus said it was okay for him to have done it. So it's the teaching that matters. Whether he got every name or every detail correct, it just doesn't matter. So that's how I would talk about it.
Would you say the gist of the story is what's important, not the details?
Yeah. And when we say gist, of course, the gist can be there's a range, right?
Right.
And I'm talking not a really broad range. I'm talking, there's not much liberty here. So
Right.
if there's something like, let's just say Mark got the Abiathar name wrong. Let's just assume that for a moment. He may not have, but let's just assume he did. The story, everything in the story, the principle in the story, everything else is correct about it. It's just a very minor detail.
Okay. Good. Who's next? Who do we have next? Stephen?
By the way, with the Gospels, again, only a handful of these very difficult ones, and every last one of them is in the peripheral details, just small details, no major discrepancies.
Right. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment on the last question about is there a supposed contradiction or error in the Mark II passage? Most commentaries I've read say like during the days of or time of will typically comment that this doesn't necessarily mean during the reign of, but it could mean during the lifetime. So in a sense, and in the story of Ahimelech, who was the high priest at the time in the 1 Samuel 23 passage, was killed, but then his son Abiathar then succeeds him as high priest there, or as priest there. So I've always used that when I've talked with people who bring that up as some sort of objection as, well, I think it can be reconciled if you talk about it that way. You'd be talking about the time of, or the lifetime of Abiathar, not his like reign as priest. So, but I had a question on what would you consider to be the best like material evidence for the resurrection that you have kind of examined or used in debates before?
Okay. Let me go back to the Abiathar thing just for a moment before I talk about resurrection. I think that the explanation you give is possible, but to me, it sounds like a bit of a stretch.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you go to the text, it clearly says in the Old Testament that Ahimelech was the high priest and Abiathar was his son. So why would you talk about it being in a lifetime of Abiathar, the high priest? Because Mark says it was in the days of Abiathar, the high priest. Why even mention Abiathar when he's such a minor character at that point? Ahimelech is clearly the high priest at that point, not Abiathar. So I think we can try. Look, I was talking to a Mormon years ago, a friend of mine who's a Mormon. He was a former bishop. And I brought up to him a problem with the Book of Mormon. I said, look, the Book of Mormon talks about how there was this big battle between the Lamanites and the Nephites around the year 400. And it was on the Hill Cumorah, which is up in Palmyra, New York, near Rochester. And the Book of Mormon says that hundreds of thousands were killed and died on that hill, and they weren't buried. So if that were the case, we're only talking 1,600 years ago. We should be able to go to that hill and find a lot of skeletal remains, maybe some sort of weapons, things like that. But they've never found as much as a button on that hill. Why? If that battle actually happened, why is it that we don't have a scrap of evidence for that? And if the battle didn't happen, we get what we would expect, nothing. If the battle happened, we would expect a lot of artifacts, but what do we have? Nothing. So how do you explain that? And the bishop's wife said, well, maybe God took the bones to heaven. Well, maybe he did. But really, that seems to be a bit of a stretch in order to get out of a tight spot. And I agree with you, Stephen. A number of commentators, evangelical commentators, will say that about how, well, it was during the lifetime of Abiathar who became a high priest. Well, that's possible, but that does seem to be a bit of a stretch to me, because the text in the Old Testament clearly says Ahimelech was the high priest and Abiathar was the son. So I don't think those kinds of reconciliations really help us. I think it almost makes it look like we're saying God took the bones, and it might satisfy our desire to have scripture today that's errorless. But I think it hurts when we're talking to non-believers. Why not just, I would think it'd be better to just say there's a scribal error there than to say that kind of thing. Well, it was during the lifetime of Ahimelech. There's just no evidence for that. What do you think of that answer, Stephen?
No, I think it's definitely a good answer. And to the larger category you're referring to, this thirst for trying to give evidence for an inerrant text. Yeah, I agree. I just think for this particular one, I don't know if it's as much of a stretch that is so inconceivable or not like satisfiable enough that people will think that, you know, it's to the same degree as God taking the bones with the Mormon example that you gave. But
Yeah, it
no,
may
I
not be
appreciate
that
it.
much
I
of a
appreciate it.
stretch, sure. All right, in terms of some of the best evidence for the resurrection, if I were to give the one thing that I think would be the strongest evidence for the resurrection, it's got to be Paul. Because someone could say, well, the disciples, of course, they were, you know, they loved Jesus, they were his followers, you know, and they wanted to just continue it, and it's propaganda, and I think we can answer that. But they can't say that about Paul anyway, because Paul, by his own testimony, not just the book of Acts, but even in his undisputed letters, like Philippians, like First Corinthians, he talks about how he persecuted the church, and then he became a Christian when the risen Jesus appeared to him. So you've got a guy who was not only unsympathetic, but was hostile to the Christian church. He became a Christian. And then through Paul, through the what we know from Galatians, that he writes about meeting with Peter, and then in Galatians 1, and then in Galatians 2, he meets with Peter, James, and John, the pillars of the church, and the four of them, they're talking, and he runs the gospel message past them that he'd been preaching to make sure that he's on message with what they're preaching. Now think about that. Paul is in the same room with Peter, James, and John. We just read this in Galatians and we skim over it. But I want you to try to picture yourself as a fly on the wall, listening to Peter, James, John, and Paul talk about the gospel and theology. I mean, wouldn't that just be a thrill of a lifetime? That'd just be amazing. Well, he says he did this. He ran the gospel message past them, and they certified that he was preaching the same message they were preaching. And through the writings of Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who knew Peter and John respectively, they talk in a very laudatory manner of Paul. In fact, Polycarp says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And then there, in 1 Corinthians 7, we can even test Paul and show that he was very meticulous, very, what is the word I'm trying to, I can't think of it at the spot, but he was very careful not to press the data further than it could bear. He's talking about tradition, historical Jesus traditions that had been passed down to him. And when he didn't have those traditions, he refused to make something up. So the bottom line is, we've got Paul's testimony that he's preaching what the Jerusalem apostles are preaching. We've got the testimonies of Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who knew Peter and John, saying that Paul was preaching the message correctly. And then we can even test Paul to see that he was very thorough about and careful to preach only what Jesus had said, and he would distinguish his own rulings for what Jesus said. So when he's talking about what Jesus said, we can be entirely confident. When he's talking about the gospel message, we can be entirely confident that we are hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. And then in this oral tradition that goes back to those apostles in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, he talks about that he had delivered to the church at Corinth, what he had received from those apostles. And he talks about the death, burial, resurrection, and the appearances to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500, to James, to all the apostles. And so we've got individual appearances, multiple appearances, group appearances, and even appearance to an enemy. And just through that, we can eliminate hallucinations. We can eliminate legend that developed over time, because we're going back to the eyewitnesses themselves. The fact that Paul and these apostles were willing to suffer continuously for their faith shows that they truly believed this, so that they weren't lying. Just through Paul, we can eliminate deceit, hallucinations, and legend. Just from Paul. And we can get back to the Jerusalem apostles themselves proclaiming the resurrection. So if there's one evidence for the resurrection that's the strongest, it's Paul. It's phenomenal. He was an enemy who's proclaiming this. Not a disciple, but an enemy, one-time enemy who proclaimed this.
And Mike, I gave away a free copy of your book, Paul versus Muhammad, to a Muslim in the Union at Ohio State, and I still haven't heard back. But anyway,
Oh,
I'll let you know. Okay, who's next? Who's next? Tom. Tom, go ahead. Fogarty, then Armand. We'll go after that. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Tom.
So my question is something that Bart Ehrman talks about, is the use of this term, the Son of Man, which I believe has, a lot of roots in like the book of Daniel. And I don't know a lot about it, so I'm just trying to get a better idea of what exactly the controversy is surrounding that term, and whether or not it, Ehrman tries to argue that Jesus never claimed to be God, and that this term, has a different meaning than people usually ascribe to it. So I'm wondering if you can expand or explain on that at all.
sure. Well, let me say, first of all, that Ehrman has recently, in the recent years, he has changed his mind, and now he thinks, even though he doesn't think that Jesus claimed to be God or divine in any sense, he does say that our earliest gospel, Mark, has him proclaiming himself as divine, which he didn't believe before. Now, in terms of the Son of Man, it's interesting. There's been a lot of literature written on this, and there is debate, there's disagreement, and I'd be oversimplifying it by explaining some things, but I'll try to do that. But just know I'm oversimplifying things.
Mm-hmm.
You're right about the Son of Man in Daniel 7. Now, if you read that context in Daniel 7, it does seem to be talking about Israel, the nation of Israel, even though it's talking about the Son of Man, like a person. It's talking about the nation of Israel. But when Jesus is alluding to Daniel 7 at his trial, when he says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven, he is definitely referring to the Son of Man in Daniel 7, but he's applying it to himself. And this is not the only time of this occurring. We find it in First Enoch, a Jewish writing that Jude in the New Testament quotes from First Enoch. First Enoch was written, trying to think, things have changed within recent years. It used to be that it was, they believed it was written in the early 1st century, and then later on, the majority seemed to think that what was called the similitudes or the parables of First Enoch, I think that's something like chapter 63 and thereafter, that they were written in the latter part of the 1st century. But now, from what I hear, First Enoch, most scholars think, was written sometime in the 1st century BC and maybe into the early 1st century. And that mentions a Son of Man figure, like we see Jesus referring to, one who is worshiped and served and comes in judgment, and he's divine. He's God in some sense. And then later on, I think it's a 2nd century writing, I'm not sure, but it's 4th Ezra. And that talks about the same kind of individual, except it calls it the elect one. Okay, which interesting, Luke at the Transfiguration says, God's voice says, this is my son, my chosen one. The word there is the same as elect one. So this Son of Man, this elect one from Daniel 7, First Enoch, and then also 4th Ezra, is this divine figure who will come to judge the world. And Jesus is obviously thinking of himself as this figure throughout like in, I think it's chapter 13, verse 26. I think that's it, but don't hold me to it. He talks about the Son of Man coming in glory and with angels.
Hmm.
And then, his confession before the high priest and the Sanhedrin saying he'll be seated at the right hand of power. In other words, a co-occupant of God's throne and coming on the clouds of heaven. I mean, this is why the high priest tore his clothes and called it blasphemy. He knew what Jesus was saying. He was claiming to be God's uniquely divine son, that if God has a DNA, Jesus shares it. So when I, and here's, you're going to get excited about this now. So when we come to the Gospel of Mark, here's something that I recognized as when I came to the Gospels and read them as ancient biographies. One little bit of background knowledge here. Plutarch, I mentioned him. In the most cited passage of Plutarch, it's the first chapter of his biography of Alexander the Great. And I'm loosely paraphrasing here, summarizing. He says something like, now, I ask you as a reader to bear with me patiently, because I'm not going to be mentioning a lot of Alexander's great deeds, because this is not a history I'm writing, it's a biography. And just as when a painter is painting a portrait of someone, that painter focuses a lot on the face and especially the eyes in order to capture the personality and character of that person. And he says, so am I through my biographies. They called them lives back then, not biographies, like the life of Alexander, the life of Caesar. He says, so am I in my lives. I am going to mention only those events that capture who this person was, their character. So with that in mind, we come to the Gospel of Mark, because Mark's an ancient biography. How does it open up? It says, as Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. Well, it's not Jesus preparing the way of God. It's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. Well, what does that say about who Jesus was at the very first verses of Mark's gospel?
Hmm.
It's John the Baptist preparing the way for God, Jesus. Come to chapter 2. Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives him his sins. And the Jewish leaders there say, well, that's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. Yep. Chapter 3. Jesus is, I think he's in a boat. They wake him up and he calms the wind and the waves. Well, the Old Testament says that that's something that only God does. Chapter 4, Jesus is, he cast out demons, and they say, well, this is Satan casting out Satan. Well, Jesus gives a little parable here, and he says, look, if you want to rob a strong man, you've got to go into his house and bind the strong man first, and then you can plunder his house. What he's saying here is his exorcisms, he's binding the strong man, and that's Satan. Well, what human can bind Satan? And then you come to chapter 5. He raises the dead, which is something only God does. The Old Testament says only God does. And they say, well, wait a minute. Prophets and apostles raised people from the dead. Yes, but they did so by praying and appealing to God and his power. Jesus did it by his own power. He didn't appeal to God. He just raised them with his own authority. And then chapter 6, he walks on water, which is something the Old Testament says only God can do. And you just keep going through the Gospel of Mark, and all these things that Jesus claims about himself and the deeds that he does are things that God does. So when you read the Gospel of Mark in view of it being ancient biography, you see that he's doing just what Plutarch does, and it's not just Plutarch, this is what ancient biography was to do. You are to list the deeds and sayings of the person that illuminate who they are. And what Mark is doing through Jesus's deeds and his sayings, he's illuminating that Jesus, through his deeds, through what he's saying, is claimed to be no less than God's uniquely divine son. And so it's crystal clear in Mark when you read it in that sense. The Christology in Mark is no less than what we find in John's gospel. The difference is in John's gospel, Jesus is explicitly saying it. Whereas in Mark is using Jesus' deeds. He's telling us who he is through his deeds.
Awesome. All right, Armand, you have a question? Armand?
Yep. Yeah, Dr. Licona, I just wanted to first and foremost just share my appreciation for you, and your scholarship has definitely been an aid to me. I really appreciate. I feel like you have a very honest approach in your scholarship, and to a fellow perpetual doubter along with you. I definitely, I'm very grateful for that. So I just wanted to say that first.
Well, thanks, Armand. I appreciate that. And I just think we don't have to fear truth, right?
Yeah.
And what I tell my students at HBU, when we have a course called Scripture and Apologetics Implications, and when we start going through some of these thorny things in the Gospels, a lot of them start to get kind of, And I said, look, we're not surprising God. This is his Scripture. And the highest view of Scripture is the correct view of Scripture. And if we truly love Scripture, we will accept it as God has given it to us, rather than forcing it into a mold of how we think he should have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's well said. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. No, I'm just kidding. So I have a mini question first. It's when is season 4 of the Risen Jesus podcast coming out?
Oh, it's out now, brother. You've been missing it. I think we're already through the sixth episode. So what you need to do is go to my YouTube channel and subscribe, and then get that, hit that bell alert. Do you watch it on YouTube, or do you do it on iTunes or
YouTube? Yeah.
Okay. So you got to subscribe and then hit that bell, and you'll get an email every time a new episode comes out.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, the next one will be out Thursday, but they're all like, as 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes each. So you can just go back and catch up on them.
Awesome. Cool. Good to hear. So my question is in regards to Ehrman's. I've heard Ehrman say a lot of times in debates with you, and recently on in his debate with or conversation with Peter Williams. He likes talking about that, like, you can have these real places and real people and whatnot, but they don't necessarily have to be the real events taking place. And I was just wondering how you would respond to that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I mean, there was fiction back then that talked about real places and real people. However, as Keener has pointed out, and this is something that Peter Williams should have brought up, but I don't know how deeply he's gone with some of these things. He's written his book on the reliability of the Gospels, but it's all just really basic ground level stuff, and it's not robust in the stuff that really deals with it. I've got the book. Listen, I love Pete Williams, and he's a great scholar in terms of textual criticism, but I don't think I think he could go a lot deeper with the stuff on the reliability of the Gospels. So what Keener has pointed out, by the way, if you're looking for a good Greek New Testament, they just came out with one a couple of years ago, Tyndale, Cambridge, with and Peter Williams and Dirk and a couple others were involved in putting this. It's a great Greek New Testament. They've just done a phenomenal job. Anyway, so as Keener has pointed out, historical novels back then almost always involved fictitious characters. Now, on occasion, they would talk about real characters, historical figures, but there is no instances of a historical novel in which a real character, a historical person who had actually lived, they don't appear in it if that person had lived within even a century of the author. So I think Peter Williams would be correct and Ehrman wrong here by saying this doesn't really matter, that the Gospels contain historical figures and historical places.
Mhm.
We've got Herod the Great, his sons, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip, Herod Archelaus are in the Gospels. These are historical characters. You've got Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, Caiaphas, Pontius Pilate, James. Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. You've got Jesus, who's mentioned by a number of non-Christian sources. So you've got all these historical characters, and the gospel, I mean, the one that would be furthest removed would be Herod the Great, right? And the Gospels, let's say Mark, majority of scholars think Mark was written somewhere between the years 50 and 70. So let's just go 70. So Herod dies, I think it's 4 BC or something like that. So you say 75 years difference, right? That's not long by ancient standards. That's not the distant past. You've got, all these different characters within that 75-year period. That's the furthest removed. You're talking Pilate. Now, Pilate, I don't know when he died, but I think he was the governor of Judea until the year 36 or 39. I don't recall which. Let's say 36. So within 35 years, let's say, 30 to 35 years removed from Pilate. And James, he's mentioned in Mark, and James dies around the year 62, 64. So, I mean, within 5 years, 6 years at most, the Gospel of Mark is written after the death of James, a real historical character. At the very most, it might have even been written before James died. Remember, Keener says there's not a single account of a historical novel, fiction, in which a historical figure is mentioned who had lived within 100 years of when that novel was written. And here we've got all these historical characters. We know that they existed, and they're within 75 years. So I think it's a really good point, to say these are real characters here. This isn't fiction that's being written.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, anybody else? Who's next? Don't be shy. Steven, you got another question?
I do. Well, of course, I got a lot of questions. But
No, not you. Tell Dr. Licona where you're studying right now.
Where I'm studying, or
Yeah.
where I'm studying?
No, where you're studying. Where? What seminary?
Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a good seminary, man. It is. They've got a lot of great professors there. New Testament. Jonathan Pennington is a good friend of mine. He's a great guy. But you've got all kinds of good New Testament scholars there. So you're in good hands up there.
Yeah, I'm doing my MDiv in Islamic Studies right now. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I do. I interact with a lot of Muslims mostly, so that's where a lot of my apologetics are geared towards. So one of my big weapons I use is the resurrection, which is probably the Achilles heel of Islam. Really, it's history. Most undoubtedly, the resurrection is probably the biggest, I think, criticism against Islam. So I mean, I definitely do appreciate your scholarship and all the work you've done. It's definitely been a great help for me too. I have a question related more to the Gospels. While I was at Ohio State, when I would interact with a lot of the professors in my field, they would always say that the Gospels were written far after the events of when they supposedly they describe, and they would say that they would be dated like anywhere from like post 70 AD, and they would even doubt the actual authors of the Gospels. So what would be the best evidence that you could give for the dating of the Gospels and their authorship being, like how we kind of attribute them to be?
Well, I would refer you to an article that was published in Religions, a journal, last February of 2019. And It's open access, so you can view it for free. In fact, I've got a copy of it on my website, risenjesus.com. So you go to risenjesus.com and look probably under blog, and just go down a little bit. And it's about a comparison. It's talking about historical reliability. I forgot the title of it, but it's comparing the Gospel of Mark with Suetonius's Life of Augustus. Now, even though Plutarch is regarded as the greatest ancient biographer, Suetonius is thought of as the ancient biographer that writes closer to how modern biographers write than any other ancient biographer. And so I wanted to compare his Life of Augustus is regarded as his finest biography. And so I compare that. I talk about what do we mean by historically reliable when we're looking at ancient sources. I provide 4 criteria, and then I assess Mark and the Life of Augustus by Suetonius using those criteria. And one of those things has to do with authorship. So I think you'll find that article helpful. Okay. So, but the short answer here for you would be in terms of, when they were written, let's say 35 to 65 years later is what most scholars would say. Or really with Mark, I've got a grad student right now who's doing some work on this. He's finishing up things, and the dating he has found that whereas you'll find a lot of New Testament scholars saying Mark was written between the years 65 and 70. They'll say that's what most scholars say. We have found he's checked out 207 critical scholars that have commented on this since 1965. And a majority say that Mark was written between 50 and 70. But if you wanted to narrow that further, 65 to 70 is still there, but that's when you have to narrow it. You could still take a majority and say 50 to 70. But even so, and then John, most scholars think, was written about 65 years after Jesus, so around the year 95. So my wife and I, we love watching World War II documentaries. We're just really into it. And even today, you'll still have World War II vets who are being interviewed on the History Channel and other documentaries. But World War II ended 75 years ago. 75 years ago. And we're still interviewing eyewitnesses. The Gospel of John at the latest was written 65 years after Jesus. Now, if the Gospels were written too long after the events they purport to describe, then I think that those New Testament scholars like Ehrman and others should go to the History Channel and say, stop. It's too long after. We can't trust these guys anymore. And then what do we do with Vietnam vets, right? What are Vietnam vets? The war was over in 1975. That was 45 years ago. Well, plenty of Vietnam vets that people are still interviewing. Just about 2 years ago, Ken Burns came out with his documentary on the Vietnam War, right? It's 45 years later. Let's just say he interviewed them 40 years later. Now we're at the Gospel of Mark. It's not too late.
Right.
I'm going to be 59 in a couple of months. I can remember things back when I was my first Major League Baseball game I attended. I remember a lot of things about that game. I remember where I sat. I remember who I was in Baltimore, so I was an Orioles fan. I remember we were playing the Cleveland Indians that night. I remember the pitcher for the Orioles was Jim Palmer. I remember one of the Cleveland Indians got their only run because he hit a home run. I remember that we won 4-1. And I remember that the last out was caught by our infield pop-up, and was caught by our shortstop, Mark Belanger. And I've been able to check some of this with some records and found out that my memory is accurate there. So I remember this, and yet this was, almost 50 years ago. 35 to 65 years later is not too long. And then when it comes to the authorship, well, I'll just say this to keep my answer from drooling on here. We have better evidence for the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John than we do for that Plutarch is the author of the 48 lives that he wrote that have survived. and he's considered the greatest of the ancient biographers, and the classicists do not question whether Plutarch wrote those 48 lives that have survived. And yet, like I said, the evidence that we have that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels is superior to what we have for Plutarch writing those 48 lives.
And Mike, what do you think about Richard Bauckham's work and contributions to that, like gospel authorship and the eyewitness stuff? And do you think he's done a big dent there, provided a big dent in that area? Or it's kind of debated still.
Well, of course, people are going to debate some stuff. But no, I think Bauckham's work is fantastic. In fact, I read the first edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and then I received a copy of the second edition to review it. So I reviewed it for NTS, New Testament Studies, which is published through Oxford, and it's a great book. I mean, if you read the first one and you don't have the second one, the extra 100 pages in the new one is worth purchasing the second thing, because he really elaborates on some things. He clarifies himself. He makes his arguments a little stronger. I had some hesitations with this first one, but he does clarify some things in the second edition. I think he's got a strong argument about eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. I still go with the traditional authorship of John's Gospel. I might be wrong. I'm in a small minority of scholars who think that still. But he still thinks, he's linking John's Gospel to one of Jesus' minor disciples. And the majority of Johannine scholars today still think that John's Gospel is rooted in eyewitness testimony, even if it weren't written by an eyewitness. It's still getting his information from the eyewitnesses. That's what a majority believe today. But I think Bauckham's, I may not agree with everything he says in that book, but boy, he's got some great stuff in there.
Yeah, I thought
for eyewitnesses especially.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. Okay, well, maybe just one more. We got to wrap up here. Anybody else? One last question, maybe?
I was going to say something.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Who are you, by the way? Can you introduce yourself?
Oh my goodness.
I can't see your face. Who is this talking?
You can't see me. I'm Cade. It's
Okay.
Cade
Oh,
Cover.
Cade, I'm sorry. I didn't you cut your beard off. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead,
My
Cade.
bad,
I'm
sorry.
sorry. It is you. I didn't recognize you without the beard. Go ahead.
I won't go if another student wants to go. I don't want to take up time.
No, you're fine. But you have a historical background anyway.
Okay,
History guy.
yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
I'm a history adjunct right now. I teach American history and world history, and I very much appreciate your scholarship and your, all that you put into this, your friendliness and everything. So my question was concerning the extra biblical sources. Some people say they're very important about Jesus. Some people say they're not very important. What is your opinion on the extra biblical sources, the Jewish and Roman sources that mention Christ? How important are they in affirming for New Testament reliability?
Well, I can say that even skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman would say that we can get a significant amount of information about Jesus from the Gospels, despite their hesitations with the Gospels. They still think we can learn a lot about Jesus from them. We can mine the Gospels and still get facts about Jesus that are pretty certain. So that would be one thing. Ehrman would say that the Gospels are our best sources about Jesus. Okay. And most skeptical scholars would say that too. That said, we can mine some data from some non-Christian sources, a brief outline, you could say, of the life of Jesus. So most of them will say that Josephus has some things to say about Jesus, even though they will agree, and it's probably so that a Christian later on doctored up the text to say some things in a more certain way than what Josephus actually said it. But we can still learn some things about, a revised text of Josephus, of what most scholars think that Josephus actually said. It's virtually undisputed that Tacitus mentions Jesus and what he says. You'll have a few skeptical scholars who will question Tacitus, but by far, most scholars think Tacitus does mention Jesus. You've got Lucian, who mentions Jesus's crucifixion. You got Mara bar Serapion. So we can get some basic things about Jesus's crucifixion and what happened afterwards and who he taught and where he taught, that he had a brother named James. The Jewish Talmud has some stuff about Jesus, but it's not reliable. But the Talmud has a lot of unreliable things. They weren't a lot like a lot of Hindu stuff. They weren't really concerned with being accurate with their historical stuff. It just wasn't a concern of theirs.
Do you ever might get the comment that it's just hearsay? It's not based upon history. It's just hearsay. I get that comment a lot, but I think that they had, access to some records, some ancient Roman records that we don't have today, probably. What's your take on that? When
you say hearsay, are you talking about the non-Christian sources?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Josephus is born in the year 37 to a popular Jewish priest in Jerusalem named Matthias. So he grows up in Jerusalem. Since he's born in 37, I mean, this is only 4 to 7 years after Jesus' death. And it's during a time when the church is really growing in Jerusalem. And the book of Acts says that there are a number of Jewish priests who are becoming Christians. So Josephus, they must have had some interesting discussions at the Josephus family dinner table. Josephus was interested in religious things. He later became a Jewish priest and a Pharisee. So he never became a Christian, but he would have certainly, he's growing up at the same time and the same geographical area in which the church is growing. So he definitely hears the gospel. He hears about Jesus. He probably hears the apostles preaching. He knows the apostolic message. It's not just hearsay. Tacitus, I don't know. We don't know where he got his information, but I doubt that he's going to rely on Christian sources. He's probably looking at imperial records or eyewitness testimony or testimony from records that are no longer extant, from Pilate or that were, just known at that point. But certainly, he is not only an unsympathetic source. Tacitus is hostile because he calls Christianity a mischievous and evil superstition. So he's not going to consult with the Christian sources for his history, right? Lucian, he just mentions Jesus being crucified in Palestine. So what's the big deal about that? You could say that's hearsay, but there's a lot of that going on, oral history that's going on. Plutarch probably used, Suetonius probably used a lot of that when he's writing about Nero, and especially emperors like Otho and Galba and others that came after it. He's just going on oral history, things that he's hearing. So just to say it's hearsay, I think, that's an oversimplification of things.
Mike, it seems like Bart always harps on oral tradition too, as we noticed in his debate with Pete Williams. A lot of, and I thought that you guys did a good job on that panel with Kurtzstein on that. But I feel he's really too hard on oral tradition as well, in my opinion, on some of the stuff he says. So, granted, we don't know everything about it. It's an oral phase. We weren't there to, we don't have anything. All we have is a written phase. But still. I think he's
I think this is a good point you make, and something Dade will be able to appreciate here. As an American history professor, when we talk about the famous liberty or death speech of Patrick Henry, that's based on 2 or 3 eyewitness sources. They had no notes. We have no notes from Patrick Henry from that speech. It's being recalled. I believe it's from 3 eyewitnesses who were there, who took no notes. They are recalling it from memory 41 years later.
Right.
So
that's pretty cool.
What we have of the speech of Patrick Henry is a reconstruction for which, because the speech was only heard once. No notes, no audio recordings, no video recordings, recalled from memory 41 years later. There's no way that they're going to remember that entire speech. So it is representing a gist of what he said. It is not a verbatim representation. Now, go back to Jesus. Jesus was an itinerant teacher, preacher, traveling around Judea and Galilee, and he's not like a pastor today where you have to come up with a new sermon every Sunday. He probably had a dozen to 20 different sermons, and he preached these same sermons just countless times. And so the disciples, it's not like they heard what he taught once and they are reporting this 40 years later as the Gospels are being written. They heard this countless times from Jesus. They went out while he was with them and they taught these in twos. They could correct one another. They came back, they heard Jesus teach more. He would debrief them. He'd show them how to change the parables according to their audience, whether they were speaking to a Gentile or Jewish audience and things like this. And so they're teaching the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over. He's debriefing. And then after he dies, they're teaching the same things for decades, all the way up until the time where they're able to relay this in the Gospels. So it's just so different from Patrick Henry's speech. We have every reason to think that the traditions we are hearing about Jesus are reliable traditions precisely because of the number of times they had reviewed these things countless times over and over and over all the years that they'd been teaching these things. So what Ehrman's view of the oral tradition is like being passed around like the game of telephone.
Right.
In order for that to be true, it's like shortly after Jesus' death, the apostles would have had to whisk themselves away on a religious retreat and were never heard from again. But Paul's undisputed letters and the book of Acts discredits such a view. Moreover, Ehrman would have to think that the gospel authors they lacked the desire and they lacked the ability to sift through traditions about Jesus. And this is assuming they didn't know the eyewitnesses or weren't eyewitnesses, that they would have lacked the discernment or the desire to be able to sift through traditions about Jesus and retain those that they were confident were rooted in eyewitness testimony. And then also, we have good evidence that the Gospels are rooted in eyewitness testimony. If they weren't written by eyewitnesses, they're rooted in eyewitness testimony. So this thing about the oral tradition being swirling around like the game of telephone is ridiculous. And there's no question that stories did swirl around and got corrupted over time. But that is an entirely different matter than saying that that's what we have in the Gospels today.
Right. All right. Well, this has been great. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know you're busy. I know this is a very interesting time in our country. Well, I would say your work right now on the resurrection is very, very important to our current climate. People, seeking hope and trying to figure out how to get through this virus issue. And so I just want to encourage you to keep putting out as much material as you can, as you already are, because we really need it, as most of us are trying to put out as much material as we can. But the resurrection is so important right now. So, if that happened, obviously it shows God intervened into history and he knows what's going on right now in our country. He's not oblivious to it. So we need to be praying for people to be open to the good news. But why don't we go ahead and say a word of prayer. I did record this tonight. I'm not going to just post it anywhere. I have to see how it looks because it's the first time I've recorded a Zoom thing. So let me take a look at it, how it looks, and then we'll go from there. And then I'll have Mike look at it too. But Mike, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. And may the Lord just bless you with risen Jesus and your ministry and your family right now. And let's close with the word of prayer. Lord, we just thank you for this time. We thank you, God, for Mike, Dr. Licona. We pray, God, you just bless him and risen Jesus and his family right now. We pray, God, that all the material that he's putting out on the resurrection would reach people. We pray people find hope in the risen Jesus because, in all honesty, if he is risen from the dead, that changes the whole climate here. It changes everything. And we just pray, Lord God, that you strengthen Mike and all his ministry responsibilities and just bless him abundantly with peace and understanding and just stamina. We pray for all of us, God, that you meet all those pressing needs in each one of us and our families, God, as we try to get through these days and be a light to those people around us. And we pray this all in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thank you
Thanks,
so
brother.
much. We really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
nice being with you all. Great
Hey,
conversation.
we will have you back in person. We just need to find you somebody to debate besides Richard Carey or Matt Dillahunty. Anyway, I'll be in touch. Thanks so much, Mike. We appreciate it.
We
All right,
should,
thanks.
we should do a Muslim apologist.
Yeah, we're trying.
That'd be good.
Well, I've debated Shabir Ali and
Yeah, I
Ali
see that
Ati.
one. Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, I know the Shabir Ali one. That one's, I mean, I personally would love that because I think it would introduce a lot of Muslims to New Testament scholarship and would very much crumble their own historical revision. But I would love to see that again.
Mike, we have a huge Muslim population here in Columbus, so maybe that will be our next debate, a Muslim. We'll see.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do it.
Okay, listen, take care, brother. We appreciate it.
All right, guys. God bless you all.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Take care.
Licona.
All right, guys, thanks so much. I'll follow up with you this recording, and you guys let me know if you need anything, but we'll go from here. Does anyone else want to talk about anything?
Yeah, I did. I didn't get to ask any questions, but it's okay.
What? I asked if anyone wanted any more questions. You didn't.
I tried. I hit my mic. Can you stop the recording, though?
Yes, hold on.
Okay.